Hey folks, Matt Lange here. SplitEQ, the new EQ from Eventide, is incredibly powerful while also being very creative, and I'm going to show you some of my favorite ways to use it. So let's dive right in. So with SplitEQ, conceptually, it's an EQ where you get to separate the transient and tonal properties from an audio source, which, when you actually get into the practice of doing it, is really interesting, especially because, well, let's not kid ourselves, drums, percussion, they're going to be really the most powerful things that you could theoretically use something like that on because the transients are so obvious. So I decided, let's put this on some acoustic drums. And this is the before. And here's after using SplitEQ. So there's no dynamic processing at all. All the tightness that was created just then is entirely from using SplitEQ. So let's check out how I did that. So first thing I did, let's take a look at the kick. The kick, not the kit, the kick. Sounds like that. And I really want to make it a little bit punchier, but the thing is, there's like some room noise printed in it. I don't want to make it muddy by bringing up low end and the room noise. So this is where being able to separate the transient from the tonal properties is really helpful. So let's just take a look. I'm going to bypass my EQ moves for the time being. Here's the transient. Here's tonal. And that's all the room stuff, We don't really want that right now. So on transient, using basically the transient mode, I set my separation to be 100% because I don't want there to be any bleed between transient and tonal. And decay, it could have been much shorter, but I decided 38% sounded best to my ears. But here's really short. Literally just the click. Too much. So that to me is really just the punch of the kick. So then what I did, I just added a shelf. And I'm just doing it purely on the transient side. So actually, let's keep that soloed. So I'm just bumping 5 dB at 109. And this is just going to add that low end thump only on that short little bit that we were hearing through transient. It's already beefier, right? Now we unsolo it. So it's really just helping the punch. And then the other thing is then I actually ducked a little bit out of the tonal properties around that same area just to clean it up because really I don't want it. I want this to be clean. I want it to be punchy, but I don't need extra rumble that's going to come from boosting or even actually just keeping some of the low end in that room. So got rid of that. Next thing I did is there's this click in the kick, and these drums, to be honest, or to be fair, they're programmed. They came from the Get Good Drums library, one of the Get Good Drums libraries, which are fantastic drum libraries. They are also geared more towards hard rock and metal and things like that. So they tend to be a little bit clickier because that's what helps cut through that kind of mix. However, for my purposes, I don't need that necessarily that kind of click. So I just went through and I notched it out directly out of the transient. So let's solo the transient again. And let's solo this frequency in particular. That's what I don't want. But it's not in the tonal properties at all. It's really only on transient. So I just brought it right out. Just cleaned it up. Made it really nice. And then I started thinking about high-pass filters because basically when I was doing the low shelf on the tonal, I suddenly thought, well, maybe I'll just try to since all the low end's going to be coming out of the transient side anyway, maybe I'll just start high passing the actual, the tonal, the room sounds, because I don't really need them. So let's try it, right? And it sounded great. So I'm just going to do it back in real time. That's ultra clean. Like, we basically lost the room entirely, which is kind of cool sometimes. So that there, it's a really powerful trick. It's truly fantastic. And then I did something similar with the low pass filter, where I just decided, you know what, I was going to actually, you know, let's take some of the low or the high, let's low pass the tonal properties. So I did some of that too. It was really just for fun, but it works. But by that point, we're just killing the tonal side entirely, so we don't need to go that extreme. Great. Now let's talk about the snare. So here's the snare before. Here is after. That's a bit different, right? So what's going on here? You can see there's quite a bit going on of the curve. There's a pretty extreme dip in the middle. And let's start once again by, we're going to bypass any of the bands that I used. And let's take a listen first to transient. So you can hear on this one, I made it super short. And this is because I don't want the same, I'm not going to be doing the same kind of cleanup on the snare that I was doing on the kick. I'm not going to be boosting anything that has as much of a length to it. But the other thing I learned was, like, when listening to the snare, there's a little bit of a click. So I really wanted control over that just immediate click, and I didn't want to affect other parts of the audio. So that being said, let's take a listen to this transient. And I need there to be, you know, I want it to be a little bit punchier. So that's why, just using the transient mode, I just boosted, it's 180 hertz. It's really where the fundamental of the snare is itself. I boosted it by 3 dB. It gives it a little more punch. We can, you know, we can unsolo the transient. And then I also then removed that same amount from the tonal aspect, just to kind of, you know, just to make that initial hit a little bit cleaner. And the next thing I did is this, and this is where that click I was telling you about, this is how I found it. So I soloed this. And I found that. And I didn't want that. This is just the band itself, and it's really on the transient, because this is the room. It's just reverb of it, but that clickiness couldn't stand. So I simply got rid of it. Makes it so much cleaner. And then lastly, I just gave a little bit of a high-end shelf. It's around 4K, and it is affecting both the transient and tonal properties, I guess full range dynamic properties of said snare drum. Yes, that's full range. That's what we'll use. And it just gives us some high-end. I like bright snares. That makes it better for me. So that's how I use SplitEQ on a snare. And then let's talk about the hi-hats. They did not get nearly as much work as the kick or the snare, because frankly, they didn't need it. Here they are without SplitEQ. And here they are with. So what's going on here? So first of all, as you can see, there is very little going on. But the biggest thing is just on the transient itself. I'm doing a high, just a high shelf, a little bit of a boost, 5 dB, just 2.6K. And really the most important thing that I'm doing, aside from just giving the cymbal some extra presence, is that I'm really actually using SplitEQ as a transient designer. And I'm doing this by, well, really, I'm just bringing down the tonal properties. So I'm keeping the transient properties as they are, but the tonal is getting brought down. So we're just hearing more of the transient itself. And then once again, I was using, really, the source is set to full mix. I have found actually just in practice, full mix tends to be the shortest, whereas you actually use some like the other sources and the decays aren't nearly as short as full mix. So I actually end up using full mix for a lot of my sounds, mainly because it gives me really tight transient control, which is something I like. But anyway, with separation, again, 100%, I don't want any bleed. Smooth, I have set to be 0. And decay, I did 45%. The reason being, it just got a little too short if it was shorter than that. Like that's great for if I wanted to make a really clicky hat, that's killer. But I still want this to sound like a real hat. So that's what I ended up doing with that. The tonal properties, it's just room. So I brought them down a bit, and that just makes this hat just a little bit, it's brighter, it's sharper, cuts through a bit more. And then the last thing I did on my drum bus, it's a similar concept as what I did on the hat. And except instead of, there's a slight bump at 8K, like half a dB. But this time around, I just boosted the transients by 3 dB. And this time I actually did use some separation, imagine that. And it just gives everything a little bit more. So here's without it. And here's with it. So SplitEQ is killer on drums. I mean, that's really to be expected. I thought, since these are, acoustic drums for all intents and purposes, let's put them on some electronic drums just to do something a little bit differently. And so I just took a drum loop of my own, and without anything happening to it, it sounds like this. And this time around, I really wanted to make it, let's just make it really tight, all transient. And this is what it sounds like. And I find this helpful because especially with electronic drums, especially you've got the kick drums, which are really long. And I don't want to just filter it because you can do it, but you'll always have a little bit of a tail unless you high pass it really hard. And I don't want to high pass things that hard all the time. So in the case of this, for instance, I high passed, we're only hearing the transient side, so we're not even going to think about tonal. But I high passed it at 224. I could have done it shorter. I mean, that's the nice thing. I really could have just shortened the kick entirely. That's really helpful, actually. And if I wanted, just like we did with the acoustic drums, I could have then actually, let's use a different, I'm not using anything on 3. I then actually could have made the kick big again, just very short. And let's just take this. Yeah, go right there. So it's really, really handy. It truly is. But then the only other thing I did was I just wanted to bring up some of the mid-range, just make this a little bit more, give it some more presence. So these are my 2 different bands. Here's this one. This is band 5. It's at 1.8K, just giving the transients a little bit more urgency in the upper, or just in the mid-range. And then band 6, doing the same thing, just at 7.6. So this is just purely in the presence section. So all together, you know, we took this big electronic loop and made it really nice and short and tight. It's great. It's really great. Then I wanted to try this, I wanted to use SplitEQ on melodic material, and really where it's going to sound most effective to me was something that, you know, already has a rhythmic element to it, but we could accentuate it further. So I took this pad, which already has a bit of like a tremolo style thing. It's a granular loop, but for all intents and purposes, it sounds like tremolo. With SplitEQ, it's much more textural now, and let's talk about why that is. And this one, there's quite a bit going on here. So, first and foremost, as you can see, I'm not just purely in the EQ mode, I'm also using the panning mode. And that's because my high-end band here, this band, band 5, let's solo it. Oh, band 6, excuse me. It's all the air, right? But the great thing about SplitEQ, aside from the fact that you can pan bands individually, which is very cool, but on top of it, you can also assign them to a mid-side. So they could be at the middle, be in the center, be in the side, what have you. And what I did on this high band, I sent it entirely to the side, since I have other bands in there that are really like taking care of the center. So I don't worry about it. But as far as the sound field goes, this allows me an opportunity to do something quite creative. And there aren't very many tools where I can really just take, you know, one individual band and say, this is just going to be mid-side, and then this is going to be over here. And you know, it really allows you to make quite an interesting sound field. So that's what I did with the high end there. And then, for instance, over here, let's say band 3, let's solo that. Because I'm able to, you know, pan both the transient separately from the tonal side, which is also very hip, I can now make things even wider in a different way, because the transient's going to be slightly to the left, at least in the course of, in the example of band 3 here in yellow. Transient's on the left, tonal's on the right, and it widens the whole thing. It's very hip. And I'm doing something similar on band 5 as well. And it's just taking the transient, panning the transient a little bit to the right. And we can make it really sharp if we want to. But it really allows us to get creative. And then if we look at what's actually going on in the EQ, I just wanted to really bring out the textural qualities of this sound. So I just did EQ moves to really like bring out the crunch and the crackle. And for instance, like there was some mud down here in 3. So since, you know, really like what's going to be muddy in this kind of sound is the tonal characteristics. So therefore on band 3, I just dropped that low mid-range. It's around 400, 390. I dropped that by -7.5, and that just cleaned up that low mid-range a bit. Like I was saying, you know, we were like full range, both transient and tonal. I just shelved both of those down by almost 14 dB. And again, these were always just to, you know, really clean out and make it more textural. And really like the big thing I did was then boosting the high end of the transients. It's 5K. I'm boosting it by almost 15 dB, and it really makes all the weird smeary spectral stuff really come through. And it's all this, this is the mid-side thing I was telling you about, or the mid-side band. It's really noisy in a very wonderful way. So it's killer. It's really killer. Electric guitars can be a little bit tricky sometimes. They can be a little bit picky, a little bit stabby, what have you. And this is something that I found SplitEQ to be very helpful with, purely on actually a completely surgical side. So this is an unaffected guitar part right here. So you can hear their little moments where it gets a little picky. Like, should be right around here, for instance. Or actually, let's go over here. Great. So you can hear there's these little pops in there, and I wanted to get rid of those, or at least I can't get rid of them entirely, but I can smooth them out, and it would have been much more difficult to do it with, say, it would be impossible to do with just purely a transient designer or something like that. You need something that is really frequency dependent. So I just went looking, and I popped open my transient mode, and I started soloing bands. And so here's one of them. You can hear that has a little pop right in it right there. So I pulled that out, and I'm using a pretty tight cue. And then I started finding the other bands that had it. Pulled that out a bit. And remember, I'm just affecting the transient, so it's not like I'm, gutting the sound of that frequency. It's just that initial pop. Makes it a lot easier. And then I did it again with one more frequency down there. So now that's been taken out, I can unsolo these things and unsolo transient. And it just smoothed out all the sounds. So let's back it up a little bit. It's very subtle, but it just cleans it up just a little bit and in a way that isn't too offensive. So yeah, SplitEQ for cleaning up an electric guitar for the kind of like picky noises. That's super helpful. And that's kind of, really what's so fun about this EQ is like you can be extremely creative, but you can also do the surgical thing. And if we wanted to try to be, let's be a little bit weirder. Let's take this part and let's take one of these soloed bands and let's make the decay really short. Let's make the source full mix again so we can get it about as short as possible. You know what? Let's try a different band. Oh. There, let's just do the transients. Now we can bring up the volume. That's a fun little sound. And let's just print that down into something else. And the nice thing about this is now we can visually see how much SplitEQ is really splitting apart the transient from the tonal sections. It's quite a lot. I mean, it really tightened everything up. So even if we wanted to, let's go back to, our old thing we had previously of, let's say, our electronic drum track or what have you. This thing will layer in there just fine. It's very tribal almost, and that's actually a guitar, you know, that's not even a drum. So very, very cool. And then if we, you know, for the sake of recapitulating a theme from the beginning, we could bring our drums back, let's say like the live drums. Works really well, and why not? Let's just add that random loop. That part doesn't sound so good, but whatever. The whole point is, you know, like it is, obviously it's a very tech savvy tool. I'm not gonna, like, I won't lie, it took me a minute to get my head around the idea of, you know, EQing transients versus tonal qualities, and just the workflow of it. It requires a little bit of rewiring of your brain, but I have found now that, you know, I did work that out for myself. It's really powerful and it's fun. And in a way it's inspirational too, because now from like a sound design perspective, it's gonna allow me a lot new opportunities that I wouldn't have found as quickly or as easily. So SplitEQ, it's a great tool. It's extremely powerful and it's creative. It's, you know, it's all the things that I want in a tool, that it's not purely surgery and it's not purely chaos. It's, you know, happily somewhere in between the two. So as above, so below, and you know, all that kind of stuff. So signing off, I'm Matt Lange. Go check out SplitEQ by Eventide. It is well worth your time and your money, and it is super fun.